I'm Sean Aylmer, and this is Fear and Greed's Sunday feature interview. I'll be back again tomorrow with another weekday episode of Fear and Greed, the normal mix of business news and interviews that sets you up for a successful day. In the meantime, enjoy our Sunday feature interview. We've seen so many remarkable events this year. Protest rallies and riots, masks and anti-maskers, people observing lockdowns and others refusing to abide by any restrictions, and stock markets rising and falling. We've heard plenty about herd immunity, but what about herd thinking? What is it that drives group choices? Michelle Baddeley is Professor of Economics at the University of Technology, Sydney. In 2018, she published the book Copycats and Contrarians, Why We Follow Others and When We Don't. Professor Michelle Baddeley, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Thank you. Pleased to be here.
Michelle, tell us about yourself. What's your history and how did you end up where you are today?
So my very first undergraduate degree was psychology at the University of Queensland, and then I went on to do an honours degree in economics at the University of Queensland, and then moved to the Treasury in Canberra for a while. So I identified primarily as an economist, but I have a great interest in psychology, and a lot of my work brings in some of the psychological influences and how they interact with economics, which was for a long period of time a deeply unfashionable thing to be thinking about. But quite fortunately for the later stages of my career, it's allowed me to really develop interests in behavioural economics alongside other interests in macroeconomics that comes from my background in applied economics, and also some of the stuff I was looking at whilst at Treasury. So the behavioural economics, macroeconomics together, there's loads to discover and loads to do in that field, because whilst behavioural economics has been well applied to microeconomic or micro level decision making by individual people, understanding how some of these behavioural influences unfold in economies more broadly is a really fascinating issue.
When I did my economics degree quite some time ago, behavioural economics really wasn't, it was certainly a genre, but it wasn't as popular as it is today. And I think economics discipline has come a long way by it used to assume everything away. It used to assume people acted rationally and in certain ways. And I think economics, and we've even had Nobel Prizes for economists involved in rational economics from memory.
That's right. And so even 10 years ago, when I would talk to, I would call mainstream economists about behavioural economics, they were very sceptical. But it's really found its voice in recent years, because what I love about behavioural economics is it combines the analytical rigour of standard economics. And I think economics has a lot of power and insight that maybe economists aren't always very effective at communicating to the world. But alongside this analytical rigour, there's this intuitive understanding of how people think and decide that rests very well with what we observe in the world around us. So I think for me, behavioural economics is sort of an ideal combination of what economics offers and what psychology and other social sciences such as sociology, anthropology also offer.
Yeah, certainly, and becomes much richer. We'll be back with more in a minute. I'm talking to Michelle Baddeley, Professor in Economics at the University of Technology, Sydney. Now, your book, Copycats and Contrarians, Why We Follow Others and When We Don't. I'm sort of interested in why you wrote the book before we actually get to what you found. Why did you sit down and write it?
I have a great interest in very many disciplines. I'm a bit of a grasshopper like that. I have the breadth rather than the depth, maybe. But I think with something like herding, I've been very interested in for a long period of time in why people copy one another. And originally it came from looking at financial markets and speculative bubbles from a macro finance perspective, and drawing on ideas from John Maynard Keynes, who talked a lot about psychological influences in asset markets, back in the 30s. So he's been a great influence on me. But the trouble is, looking at it from a macro or systems perspective, it's very hard to understand herding and why people copy one another, because it's very much, you're looking at why an individual copies another. And so I went along to the American Economic Association meetings in the US back in 2005, I guess. And there was a session on neuroeconomics. And neuroeconomics blends insights and tools from neuroscience with insights from economics. And it just struck me that this really is the way to unravel some of these behavioural influences, because standard economics of the sort that you've described before, linking to rational choice, assumes that the brain is like a black box. Economists say, well, the information goes in, the decisions come out, and we don't really worry about what happens in between because we've got no data. But neuroscience solves that problem, because by using neuroscientific techniques, we can start to see what, to some extent, in a very rough way, see what is happening neurally when people are making decisions. And it's something that comes up in Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, that many of your audience will be aware of, that using, for example, brain imaging experiments, there are certain areas of the brain that are associated with more primitive, I'm simplifying, but more primitive emotional processing. And then there are other areas of the brain that are associated with higher levels of cognitive functioning. And using these brain imaging, we can start to see that. And so on the herding topic, I got together with some neuroscientists at the University of Cambridge, where I was at the time, to think about how some of these models from economics and behavioral economics could be taken into the scanner, into a brain scanner, to see which areas of the brain were lighting up when people were following others in a financial task. So they were asked, are you going to buy this stock share or not? What's the group doing? And we found it was an interaction. So it's both a system one, a fast emotional thinking process, alongside a slower, more deliberative process. So it's a combination. It's neither rational or irrational. It's something in between. It's an interaction of emotion and reason.
Wow, that is quite fascinating. How do you model that?
Well, lots of different ways. So the other thing I'm quite keen of, so the Copycats and Contrarians really does draw out themes from a range of different disciplines. So, there's a good economics chapter, because that's, primarily what I know most about. And there's a chapter on the social psychology of it all. So there's a lot in social psychology about how people are influenced by others, for example, in the context of obedience to authority. So people might know the sets of experiments from Stanley Milgram and also Zimbardo, the electric shock experiments, that when people are told by an authority figure to administer what might even be quite a deadly level of shock to another person, they will do it under certain circumstances. And also, the Stanford prison experiment was when students were assigned roles of prisoners and guards, and people fell into these roles really quickly and easily. And Philip Zimbardo wrote a very interesting book on this called The Lucifer Effect, which showed that it's about the context as much as anything. All of us have the capacity to be evil, but all of us have the capacity to be good as well. And it's often the context that determines how we behave. So we can behave in quite brutal ways, but if the context forces us into that. So there are insights from sociology as well. And there's a chapter on behavioral ecology, because a lot of these herding things, of course, we see in the animal kingdom as well. And so they're very multidisciplinary in that way, of taking all these different insights from all these different disciplines, trying to combine them together. And no doubt each discipline will say, well, she didn't quite get that right.
Sure.
But, that's the danger of writing a book that's so broad. But to get back to your question about methods, the other thing that I'm quite interested in is there isn't one method. You could use the standard econometric analysis of data. A lot of the research that I report in Copycats and Contrarians is this neuroscientific evidence from my experiments with the group at the neuroscientists and experimental psychologists at Cambridge. I do a lot of econometric analysis of data, but more recently I do a lot of work just working with qualitative researchers who use focus groups and interviews. And my view is that all these methods come together. There's no one method that works, but when you build up all these insights from all these different areas, then you get a really rich understanding of what's going on.
So I'm scared to ask this question, having just listened to you for the last couple of minutes, but the title of the book is Why We Follow Others and When We Don't. Is there an answer?
So the very interesting thing is that, and I apply the book to all sorts of current issues. So obviously a strong theme in there is social media, and the extent to which social media encourages us to really follow along behind people like us. So we have the echo chambers of Twitter, where we're all following people who agree with us, and we don't understand why other people are thinking differently because we don't see their Twitter feed, so there's quite an issue around that. But there's a large literature from all sorts of different disciplines across the social sciences and natural sciences around why people, animals more generally herd. But I think one interesting that's really very interesting to me, and if I were to write a second book, it would be about the contrarians, because there's much less written about the contrarians and why people don't follow others. And so my view would be that there are very few people who don't follow others at all, but there are circumstances, for example, if I dare mention his name, Donald Trump, it's not that he's not influenced by other people or doesn't form his actions in the context of what he thinks other people will think. It's just that he's appealing to quite what to us might seem like quite a narrow group of people. So we might say, well, Donald Trump is a maverick, but in a sense, he's not a maverick at all, because he's got a lot of people that
70 million people voted for him.
Yeah, exactly. And so even examples such as hipsters or punks, they might seem unconventional to an ordinary person in the street, whatever or however ordinary might be defined. But amongst themselves, they look very similar. So they're copying one another, but within their particular in-group. And so I think that it's not a simple do we follow or don't we follow, it's who we follow. Who's our in-group, who's our out-group.
Yeah, I mean, so in a sense, in the true sense of the word, there aren't that many contrarians or, for that matter, copycats. I mean, we're all kind of the same, whether you're a copycat or a contrarian.
Yes. It just depends which group you're trying to appeal to. I mean, there would be much more unusually people who genuinely don't care what anyone else thinks. And that can be for good or bad. It could be a psychopath or whatever, but it could be someone who really focuses their intellectual energy on developing something that no one's ever thought of before. And so I think another general theme or tinge to the book would be there's no right or wrong. It's not black and white. The world is not black and white.
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask, is there a value judgment in any of this?
I try not to, but I'm sure there is, because I'm human.
Yes. So if we bring it on to contemporary issues and what's happened with COVID-19, can you apply some of your findings to how people have responded? And let's take the US or even Victoria in Australia, where there's been such stringent lockdowns and pretty much everyone has followed the wear a mask rule. You know, occasionally there are breakouts. Certainly in the US, though, there's huge areas who just refuse to wear a mask and don't want to follow the rules. How can you apply your findings to those sorts of situations?
Yes, very much so. And I think the mask wearing is a particularly interesting one and I think it's a great shame that it's become politicised. Because, when I've been in London and the UK for the past couple of months, and, people are pretty good at wearing masks there, but they've got a government that has been a bit mixed up about it all. I think what's seriously impressive about Australia is the high levels of trust I know it doesn't happen in normal times, but in the context of COVID, a high level of trust in institutions and even in politicians, and the fact that a national cabinet was instituted. And I know that there is political infighting around that, but it meant that in Australia the rules were clear, and the public response really, I mean, maybe people in Australia take it for granted, but particularly in New South Wales, for a big cosmopolitan city like Sydney to manage COVID and keep the community transmission under control is seriously impressive. And so I think there's a really interesting set of research questions now around institutional trust and why Australia really has done so well. But in the UK, to a lesser extent, but certainly in the States, masks wearing has become politicised. So it means that people aren't thinking logically about what the pros and cons are about wearing masks. It's got all caught up with this individualism rhetoric, because wearing a mask isn't about protecting your own health. It's not a choice for you and what happens to your health. It's a choice about the people and the communities around you. And the fact that it's become politicized and caught up with individualism is, you saw it at Trump rallies, whole loads of people not wearing masks, and Biden and his government are going to have to deal with the consequences of that when they see COVID cases really rising rapidly. And in terms of the herding thing, it's you follow your group. Your group identifies themselves as self-interested individualists who don't want government to tell them what to do, so they're not going to wear masks. And the externalities that creates in terms of spreading the disease rapidly through the wider community, well, that's not part of their politics. They're not going to care about that. In the UK, I was wearing masks most of the time. I followed their rules are confusing. It's the other thing that Australia's done really well. Nice, clear, simple rules. Whereas in the UK, the rules are quite confused. If you're in a tier 2, London was tier 2 lockdown, and I was seeing people in Cambridge who were tier 1 lockdown, and we were meeting in an art gallery. And tier 2 people are meant to abide by tier 1 rules, even if they're in a tier 2 area. But is an art gallery the same as a restaurant? So very, very confused. But apart from that, people in the UK generally pretty good at wearing masks. But it's not a hardship. Okay, it's slightly irritating, but in the grand scheme of things, sticking a mask on is not a terrible inconvenience. So it's a great shame that these sort of herding influences have encouraged people to just follow along behind. My in-group says we shouldn't be told to wear masks, so I'm not going to wear one.
To pick up a couple of points there, does herding activity, is it more likely in Australia? We are a herd because we basically follow the rules here. So is it more likely if the rules are simple, for example? Do you think there's a cultural aspect to it? Do you think there's some other childhood aspect to it? I'm just trying to work out why Australia might follow the rules. Is it simply because they are more simple, or there's more to it?
I think it's not so much cultural, but social norms, possibly, because I think that generally, and of course there are exceptions, I think Australia is quite an affluent and stable egalitarian sort of society. And so that engenders quite a cooperative response in most cases. But the other context for Australia as well, of course, is always, for many years, right since prickly pears and cane toads or whatever, a really strong awareness of biosecurity. And in Australia, we're sort of used to having people worrying about what we're bringing into the country in quite a different and much lesser way. But I think this habit of worrying and having all the institutions in place to deal with a biosecurity risk probably helps. Also, the fact that it's not such a populous country and that it is easy to close our international borders helps as well. But I think that spirit of cooperation in Australia, it's one of the things I really love about Australia, is people are cooperative and they're egalitarian. Because that's the other thing that was coming in the UK. There seemed to be one rule for Boris Johnson and his cronies and another rule for everyone else. Whereas in Australia, there's less of that.
Michelle, stay with me. We'll be back in a moment. My guest this morning is Professor Michelle Baddeley from the University of Technology, Sydney. So herding in Australia generally has had positive outcomes. There must be plenty of examples, not necessarily with COVID-19, but just generally where herding has poor outcomes.
Yes, and so I guess this is where the value judgments might start to come in, but things like, there are parts of Australia that have quite a strong anti-vaxxer movement, for example. And so the groups that are herding around an anti-vaxxer movement, for example, that could be, or even the conspiracy theories that we were hearing about in Victoria, and herding around these sorts of ideas. And herding, the evidence seems to suggest that people who are less knowledgeable or have less evidence to work on, if someone knows a topic really well, they don't need to rely on the opinions or actions of others to guide their decision making. So people who maybe aren't so fully informed are more likely to be influenced by these herding influences. So in the context of something like COVID or any infectious disease or any of these anti-vaxxer movements, it might come from a position of people maybe not really knowing well how, say, a vaccine works, for example. And so they are more easily influenced in this sense, which maybe sounds a bit patronizing, but I think
it sort of introduces that idea of rational and non-rational and cognitive and emotional responses, which isn't patronizing. It sounds like it's the reality, isn't it?
And it's about information and education. So, making sure that people have a basic science education so they understand to an extent how a vaccine works, or having a basic education in economics and politics so they understand how some of these political ways might operate, or would understand better how democratic institutions operate, and so all these sorts of things. But I would say some of these conspiracy theories and anti-vaxxer movements would be an example of how herding takes place within a minority group, but they're still following.
It's still herding.
The herding is still happening.
So when's the next book? When's a contrarian book?
Well, no, I've really been thinking, particularly in the context of recently, because there's one chapter in my book that's about contrarians, but it's underdeveloped, and I would really love to turn that into my next book because it's fascinating. What is a contrarian? And why are people contrarians? And in fact, it's a neglected area as far as I've been able to discover across all disciplines. So having a bit more on that would be a really fascinating book to write. And lots in the context of COVID and US elections and all that, lots to write about in the context of contrarians and mavericks, for good and for bad. And there's a bit on in my contrarians chapter of that book on whistleblowers as well, because I think whistleblowing is another fascinating thing. The way that whistleblowers are vilified for often just speaking the truth, because all the vested interests pile in to say you can't say that, and so it's a sort of a power play emerges in the context of whistleblowing as well. So I think that's another aspect of the sort of contrarians maverick theme that would be interesting to develop in a contrarians book.
Get to it, Michelle. Get to it.
Thank you. I will when I find some time.
Thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
That was Michelle Baddeley, Professor of Economics at the University of Technology in Sydney.